Hello, this is Mike Swanson, and this is a segment of the Past American Century. Got a very special guest with me today. I'm speaking with Chuck Ochelli, who has the website Ochelli.com and is the host of the Ochelli Effect. How you doing today, Chuck?
Doing really good, Mike. Really good. How you?
I'm great, and thanks. This is kind of switching the table a little bit because I'm a guest on your show just about every Tuesday at 8 o'clock, and we don't necessarily talk about the Kennedy assassination, but on Thursdays you have a fairly regular segment called Sinister History, and then often you have guests on that debunk assassination myths. So your show, I think, has gotten quite a following in the Kennedy assassination research community.
Well, yeah, I've done quite a few shows on the Kennedy assassination, which is not unusual in what you would call alternative radio, but I have an unusual focus on it. So it's very regularly featured, not just around the anniversary dates, And so, yeah, I mean, and you think about it, I've had Walt Brown on, I've had Joan Mellon, I've had John, I've had just about everybody, Larry Hancock, Alan Dale, a huge amount of people. I'm missing a whole bunch of them right now. But a lot of people have come on to discuss it. Regularly, though, Carmine is with me, and he's done a couple of these segments with you. So it's really, really good to join you for this one.
Well, thanks. And it's people. I thought it'd be interesting to interview you because usually you're doing that with your guests, and I'm curious how did the assassination become such an important topic for you? How did you get interested in it?
Well, it boils down to a couple of events in life, right? I would say that the first time I really became aware about the assassination, I was like, say, 9 years old, and I was in third grade. And it was interesting because the story was sort of told anecdotally about what happened in Dallas and the fact that we had a president only a few years ago, because it was in the 70s, or maybe it was 80. Either way, it was less than 20 years prior that there had been the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And when somebody basically told me the story like this, well, the president was killed on a Friday, and by Sunday morning, the man who allegedly killed him was killed in police custody, I said, wait a minute. Something is very wrong here. And I sort of left it alone after that, but I always found it really fascinating, like whenever it would come up on TV or anything else. So that was really where it started to rattle around in my head. But again, around the actual 20th anniversary and then around the 25th anniversary, it became extremely prominent to me. And when I started to study it, I found that there was a personal relation that I could make to it that was extremely important in my mind. And this was a progressive thing that took some time. At first, like I say, it was just really a curiosity, like how is it possible that a man dies in police custody? The first thing I thought of, even as a child, was, well, if the police didn't kill him, how could you die in police custody? That's almost impossible. Did he kill himself? No, someone else killed him while he was handcuffed to two police officers. Okay, something is wrong here. But it got even more personal after that, Mike, actually.
Well, I think from my from reading the literature and stuff, that Oswald being killed by the Dallas, or in the custody of Dallas police, is what really made people around the world very suspicious about the assassination, just that happened. That's the impression I have. I wasn't alive at the time, though.
Well, right, but the interesting thing is, like, if he had been killed trying to flee, right, which, what is that, the Hollywood cover-up story for why the cops decide to kill somebody they have in custody, but that wasn't the story. A guy wandered in and just literally shot him in the gut, which was another odd thing, a gut shot killed him. But, all these details aside, here was the personal connection that I started to make. My father had served in Vietnam. And it's a very heartbreaking thing for me to talk about sometimes. But quite honestly, I feel as though I am part of a generation that was profoundly affected by the Vietnam War, because it is our fathers, our grandfathers, our uncles, the male role models, so to speak, of Generation X, had been run through the mill of Vietnam, and that includes, the disturbance in the country, the problem in the country, but it also includes more than 1 million men returned to this place we call America in a damaged way, whether physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, in some way or other profoundly damaged, and of course 60,000 dead, and that's not to mention even the million to, depending on whose estimates you listen to, 1 to 4 million Vietnamese dead, but still. This is an extremely horrific thing. Now, some people that don't know might say, how does that correlate to the Kennedy assassination? Well, when John Newman's work first got into my hands and a few other people's assertions about what had actually happened, again, this is just after the 25th anniversary, heading toward the 30th anniversary, right? That the reality is that John F. Kennedy was going to withdraw America from Vietnam long before the majority of the damage was done, long before we had been engrossed in this unwinnable war that did so much damage over a decade before we actually withdrew. Perhaps my father didn't have to go to Vietnam in 1968. Perhaps a lot of men didn't have to go to Vietnam. Perhaps a lot of things might have been different had not shots been fired in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. So, to me, the damage done by someone willfully taking the man out of the way who was going to remove us from Vietnam, and then the man coming into office who accelerated the move into Vietnam, this to me means that it goes far beyond the capital crime of the murder of a single person. It goes far beyond the damage of leadership and the undermining of the American prestige and all of that other nonsense. To me, this became a very personal thing because somebody had willfully sent my father's generation through the meat grinder, for lack of a better term. And if that was done partially because John F. Kennedy had been murdered, I thought that the exploration into the truth about it and the facts about it were all very worthwhile things that I felt almost as though anybody should have been doing. So, as a teenager, I was studying these things, learning these things, and quite honestly, I was becoming a musician, which I did in my earliest adult years, and I started to travel a bit. And as I traveled, really reading books about the assassination, reading other people's work about it, I started contacting people that were literally connected to the case because I realized I'm near somebody, and I looked in a phone book and would find a name. I would find out that, this person is in Pittsburgh, for instance. This person is in Columbus, Ohio. This person is in Florida. And I would make contact with them, and sometimes I would wind up having just phone conversations with, firsthand witnesses to different events in the assassination, just because I called them up out of the blue and said, look, I was a very curious person, and respectfully I wanted to find out if what I had read about them was true. And that really quickly graduated into me actually doing research, and digging deeper, and not just, going by these phone conversations, but starting to record them and gather documents and work with other like-minded people and so on and so forth. So it was kind of a weird sort of thing that developed organically. And meanwhile, I was only just a high school graduate, and I was encountering people that had multiple college degrees and professions that lent themselves to being able to investigate. And oddly enough, the only thing that I had which was unique among those people was the ability to talk to people that, how shall I put this? People that were in the criminal world, so to speak, that I had some familiarity with, just based again on happenstance from my life. I was able to talk to legitimate mafia figures that some of these college professors were either afraid of or did not have access to, things like that, and building up a bit of a Rolodex and a contact list of different Kennedy people that were linked to the events that led me to others and led me to be connected to other witnesses and other authors and other people that had shot films and so on and so forth over the years. And that would range from, you know, the police officer that allegedly confronted Oswald in the snack room, Marion Baker, right, to James Tague, who was the third wounded man that day, to geez, you know, let me think about it. There's a lot of different people that I encountered over those years, and it was really fascinating. Doctors and individuals who I'd come to because I'd run into one of the X-ray technicians who was present at Bethesda, who happened to work in the very same city as his boss at the time at Bethesda, where he happened to be positioned at that time. You know, it was really a bunch of circumstances that came together that caused me to get deeper and deeper into it. So here's the fun part. I wasn't planning on doing a radio show. I never planned on writing a book. I pretty much would share and give my work to others through chain letters and direct communications and you know, what did they used to call them? Like party line type phone calls, stuff like that. Early days of the internet, even, you know, on message boards a little bit, but most of it was, you know, here I have a tape of this interview. I have a tape of this interview. I happen to have a videotape of this television event. Literally trading materials and sharing things that I had discovered and copies of documents with other people that were interested, and in some cases they were creating films and books and things like that. And I just wanted to be part of the search for the truth. So there's a complete answer for you, Mike.
Well, let me ask you this. Just curious what you kind of discovered or some of it. You mentioned you talked to underworld figures or mafia types or whatever you want to call them. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the mafia was behind the assassination?
No. That was the interesting thing, because at that time it was still kind of popular because of what was it, G. Robert Blakey, I guess, had come out with the book that effectively, even after closing up the HSCA, right, he had come out with a book right after in 1980, basically saying the mob did it, right? And there was another guy who wrote a book called Mafia Kingfish, and people wanted to tie Ruby because they were calling him a mafia figure, even though he wasn't technically a mafia figure. And even in other scenarios, there were all these different places where people were trying to tie underworld figures to the assassination directly. And I don't know how I feel about their involvement today, as far as could they have been involved in some way. But those that believe in the whole mob did it scenario are sorely mistaken. They didn't organize it. They certainly weren't the ones who came up with the idea or the beneficiaries of it. I mean, you could say that Bobby Kennedy being removed as Attorney General was a benefit to the mob in general. But outside of that, realistically, there's no evidence to place any of these people in a good position, or, you know, as shooters or as masterminds. The usual suspects, you know, ranging from, in my mind, from Marcello all the way to even the accusation that the Gambino family had possibly been involved with moving the French gunmen in and out of the country, which also turns out to be another dead end when you look into the French gunman theory. But it's interesting that mafia figures are often dragged into the equation. Trafficante, everybody, pretty much, you know, in one way or another. And I would love to be able to pin it on one of them or a commission of them, but that's not. It's just not there. So there you go.
Well, if the mafia didn't do it, and as you mentioned, you mentioned one dead end, the French assassin story, which was big on a series called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. But there's countless and countless and countless dead ends and I know Carmine does shows with you debunking many of these things. And when I first got interested in this, I was a teenager too, and it was a couple years before the JFK movie came out, and the topic was already kind of heating up. And you could go in a bookstore back then, in a shopping mall, which they don't really have anymore, but you could find books, right? And so I was just buying these books and books and books and getting into this. So it was easy to kind of have an idea, of where to get information. Just go to the bookstore and buy a book. Today, there's countless YouTube videos, countless garbage everywhere on the internet, countless books that are even garbage. And so many myths. So if someone's totally new to this topic, where would you point them to get good information about it?
Well, see, that is the difficult thing, right? There's a handful of really good books, and nobody that tells you they've read everything on the assassination is telling you the truth. Just let's get that out of the way. So I'm making my best guesses based on the fact that I've sampled about 300 books out of the slew of them that are out there, right? And so it's hard to say, because there is no singular place to go that is perfect on every angle of what you might be interested in. Now, Walt Brown wrote a very interesting chronology, and it is large. Okay. It's available in electronic form. I would suggest it that way. I hear there's a way you can get it physically printed, but I think if you physically print it, it's bigger than the Warren Commission volume, so I wouldn't suggest doing that. And he includes a lot of information in his chronology that might be the most complete thing out there. But anybody who tells you that they have the most complete piece of work or the absolute answer up to this point in time, I do believe is either deceiving you or themselves or both. Now, as far as a starting point goes, JFK and the Unspeakable is an excellent book. It's got a few issues with it, but in general, if you were very fresh to the topic, I would say starting there is not a bad idea. You mentioned The Men Who Killed Kennedy, which is interesting because that's right in the alley where you and I kind of got involved in the assassination.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, too, is to consider 1988, because remember I said the 25th anniversary, right? And the JFK movie comes out, I believe, right around the 30th anniversary. In that 5-year period, though, you had Vince Bugliosi had done his mock trial, right, of Lee Harvey Oswald. You have PBS doing a widely viewed documentary. You have, and these were big things. Today, these would be blips on the monitor because of the amount of media we have. But in 1988, this was a lot. There's that. David Lifton reissued, I think, Best Evidence in '88 as well. So you see an amount of books that came out then and everything else. Today, like I said, a starting point for a novice, yeah, definitely. Definitely, I would say JFK and the Unspeakable is an excellent book. To get an overview of all three assassinations, obviously, I would tell you to go look at Carmine's book. But again, there are so many specific areas that one can go into, given the fact that this is one of the most written about events in human history. Okay, as a singular event, I do not believe there has been as much literature devoted to a singular event as there has been to the Kennedy assassination, certainly in modern history. I mean, it could be the crucifixion has more literature about it, but I'm not sure. I don't think so, in fact. And I'm not saying that's all good or all bad, but, you think about the different ways you can break this down. It's a huge, huge topic. I mean, just the evidence. Okay, which part of the evidence, right? You want to look at the medical evidence? You want to look at the ballistics? Do you want to look at the characters involved? Well, they have biographies, Do you want to take a look at the records and how they are rather strange? John Newman, his work is incredible when it comes to breaking down the documents, just the slew of documents, which at this point in time, there's over 5 million documents that were added, through the JFK Records Collection Act, not to mention the standardized, Warren Commission, House Select Committee on Assassination, reports and volumes, the Assassination Records Review Board, the various other pieces of documentation which were not necessarily drawn into those. So between official records and various theses, I guess would be the plural of thesis, that are out there regarding the assassination, it's almost impossible to squarely recommend a singular thing. Although, like I said, Walt Brown, very large, his chronology, and again, JFK and the Unspeakable, very, very good, solid book. But as you well know, there's also a ton of these formulaic, okay, here's what happened in Dallas. Okay, here's the aftermath and official explanation. All right, now here's my theory. And, the triad of disasters that are out there regarding that. There's probably easily 1,000 volumes out there by 1,000 different authors that, again, are just in general looks at it. I mean, even taking a look at the earliest work on it, like, Mark Lane's work, Rush to Judgment, right? Pretty informative, pretty interesting, very primitive regarding the evidence, but, it depends on what key it is you're looking to look at here, right? So I know it sounds like I didn't really give much of an answer, but I still gave a couple of plugs. I don't know. It's very hard to know where to start. I definitely tell you don't start on YouTube, and
one thing I'd throw in there, which I was going to talk about Vietnam, but I'll bring something else up that the general public really has no idea about. This topic, the understanding of it has changed over the years. As you said, for instance, the mafia doing it was a very popular theory in the 1980s, and now almost no one takes it seriously.
Right.
However, back in the 1980s, in the mainstream media, the big question was, did Oswald do it, or was it a conspiracy? And they were, for the most part, defending the Warren Commission report. Mm-hmm. However, there has been a shift in the past couple years, a semi-official shift. The Central Intelligence Agency has a history department. They have people who actually write histories on behalf of the CIA, and occasionally these things are declassified and released to us. Mm-hmm. And a couple years ago, they did, someone in the CIA wrote a biography of the director John McCone, who was the director at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and it says that John McCone allowed or enabled people in the CIA to engage in, the word is benign, cover-up of aspects of the Kennedy assassination. Doesn't really go beyond whatever that means, but this biography says that what the McCone was worried about was that somebody could look at Oswald's connections and believe that he was somehow connected to people connected to the CIA, and they could draw some inference from that. Mm-hmm. So therefore, he didn't want people thinking that, or he wanted a benign cover-up is the phrase that they use. But that is a long, leap from what anyone in the government would say in the 1980s.
Well, right, because in the 1980s it was pretty much, look, this kid got a lucky shot and he was crazy. That's all there is to it, and he acted alone. And then, acting alone, Jack Ruby turned around and killed him, which is effectively the Warren Commission's default position. Now, what's funny is, if you think about it, though, the idea that is there a conspiracy or is there not a conspiracy, that was the big question in the 80s, right? But the United States government's official position had already switched by then anyway, because the House Select Committee on Assassinations literally stated that it was more likely that he had been killed as a result of a conspiracy than not. And they weren't sure if it involved Oswald, but seemed to want to involve Oswald in the conspiracy. But either way, that's a huge shift from the Warren Commission's position. And by the way, both of those things still stand officially on the record. They haven't been, expunged in any way. So there has been a shift. And, some things go full circle, too, because don't forget that initially in the first couple of months after the assassination, because it had happened in Texas, Lyndon Johnson was a suspect in some people's minds. And today, once again, just like in the late 90s and a few other times, Lyndon Johnson is a primary suspect in a lot of people's minds regarding being the, quote, mastermind of the assassination and so on. So that has come back around and gone away and come back around and been scoffed at as ridiculous and come back around again, and right? So this has gone in stages, hasn't it?
Oh, definitely. And but the thing about the Lyndon Johnson story in so many of these things is, what is the evidence for it? And you've done a recent show with Joan Mellon that demolishes the evidence people used for that argument, which is basically that Johnson had an associate, Mac Wallace, who has a fingerprint on the 6th floor where Oswald was supposed to be, and that's the evidence that connects LBJ to the assassination. And she's shown that evidence doesn't hold up.
No, that's very true. But, I had this odd conversation just yesterday, and you don't know about this yet, but I'll tell you about it right here.
Okay.
I had this odd conversation. I've actually booked somebody to come on the show who co-authored a book at one point with Roger Stone. Anyway, and, he claims that there's a lot more evidence than that LBJ did it and all this other stuff, and wants to talk to me about it. His first name is Robert, but anyway, you might know who I'm talking about. He's going to come on the show, and we're going to talk about a few other things first. But basically, I had to promise that we're going to go through an LBJ discussion the next time he comes on the show. That's Robert Morrow, by the way. That's going to come on, and he's going to come on this week, and I'm going to go through this with him. And I want to hear from one of the biggest proponents of the LBJ thing. What is your evidence, actually? Because, Madeleine Brown, immediately I started to tell him, hey, look, Madeleine Brown lied. And he said, of course she did. She lied about that party. I said, okay, so what's your point then? But there's going to be a lot more to that conversation, and there's a lot of anecdotes, and there's a lot of alleged circumstantial evidence that people use to keep tying it together. But here's the problem. Could you make a narrative out of it that makes sense where you can connect A to B? Can you show that Johnson is involved in something that looks like it could have even possibly led to this? Can you show that he had the power to pull it off? Can you show that he had, means, motive, and opportunity? And, they claim up and down that he had plenty of a motive, because he's certainly not the squeaky clean figure that Robert Caro tries to show you, right? But how bad is he, and was he literally responsible for this? Not every criminal is capable of murder, and not every murder was committed by a criminal And just because Johnson is a criminal, and just because he's a bad guy, and just because he's got mistresses, and just because he took dirty money, and just because he was a dishonest person, doesn't necessarily mean that you can guarantee he murdered or arranged the murder of his predecessor. So this is the argument that I make, is that until such time as they have some evidence that'll link these things together, I'm not going for it. And, yeah, Joan's book, satisfactorily to my mind, destroys the whole Mac Wallace concept quite thoroughly, and with evidence which has not been utilized by anybody else, and with an expert who trains experts on the fingerprint evidence that we're talking about. So, this is where I come down for now. Now, look, I feel as though because we don't have an answer, we can't necessarily say I'm 100% convinced that there is no way that this scenario or that suspect or whatever could be responsible. I even leave open the people get mad at me when I say this, but I even leave open the possibility that it was just Oswald, but you're going to have to explain a lot of things away in order to make Oswald the guy. I highly doubt it, especially given the forensic work of somebody like Sherry Feaster and various other pieces of evidence that would make it very, very difficult for me to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald had done it by himself. But I can't rule out with absolute certainty almost anything because we still don't satisfactorily have an answer as far as I'm concerned. What do you think?
Well, I tell you, like the Lyndon Johnson thing. I wrote that book, The War State, and I listened to a couple of the Kennedy tapes. I mean, a couple, and there was one tape that did make me wonder, and it was a discussion Kennedy had just a few weeks before the assassination, like 3 or so, and it was a meeting about the Soviet Union, and he was going to allow American farmers to sell them wheat. He's lifting a wheat embargo. And Lyndon Johnson was in the room. This is like a National Security Council meeting. And in most of these meetings, Johnson never spoke at all. And he would just sit there. And that would actually make Kennedy mad because in the first year or two, he's like, why aren't you talking? And he's like, what is this LBJ brooding all the time? But in this meeting, LBJ spoke, and he said, this is the biggest mistake you've ever made, and I'm talking to all these people, and they're angry, and this is basically going to ruin you. And it was, and then in the back of your mind, you know the assassination is going to happen in a couple weeks, and I couldn't help but wonder, does this guy know ahead of time, and he's just like can't help himself, and he's just boasting or saying these things, and apparently after this meeting, Kennedy was shaken up by what Johnson said. Arthur Schlesinger says that this was Kennedy said this is one of the most disturbing meetings he ever had. Right. But the point of that is there's no evidence that connects Johnson to the assassination, but it was just something that can make you wonder. And that's how I think the Johnson stuff really is, no direct evidence. I don't think really the perpetrator or mastermind or whatever you want to call it, the person the most responsible for the assassination or making it happen has ever been identified. And if they have, it's just been in passing and we really have no idea. I don't know if they can be, but it's I think more I do think we'll have a better understanding of it, of what's happened, who's responsible as time goes on through the work of more researchers and stuff. But I don't really think we know yet, or it's been proven at all.
No, and you know what? I agree with you on all of that. By the way, quick side note about those tapes that I have also tortured myself with, by the way. It's really actually fascinating that you bring up this point about Johnson being there and not speaking, because there's a bunch of those tapes, and they're very difficult to listen to. Because even the way they've been preserved is just, I don't know, disastrous. I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, it's really interesting. You see a list of names of people that are supposed to be present during these tapes when they were indexed, right? And Johnson's written down on a bunch of them, and you don't hear him. You don't hear him anywhere. And some of them are almost as difficult to listen to as the phone calls, the phone tapes, right? Anyway, look, there were a lot of people that were, people do tend to forget this, there were a lot of people that were not happy with John F. Kennedy, right? And not the least of which was anybody who was going to benefit from the military contracts that would have come out of a full-on invasion of Cuba, a real clash in Germany. Let's not forget about that. The refusal to go into Laos. There's a lot of, reason for people that were going to lose a lot of money, especially if he was going to withdraw from Vietnam. Wait a minute, I came back around to that, didn't I? Here we go. He wasn't going to do these things that would have been the cash cows for the military-industrial complex. So that's a lot of people. That's not just Johnson. And Johnson and his agricultural contracts and what his concerns are, well, I don't know why he was so terribly worried about wheat when he was busy ripping off people over cotton and everything else. But, I'm just saying, I don't know. It's an odd thing. Johnson, I think, resented him. I think he didn't really have any great love for him, probably was being obstructionist with a smile most of the time. But given the characterizations from people that actually knew him, and not the sanitized history that people have tried to present about him, the great, guy who brought us a great society and actually signed the civil rights legislation and all that stuff. Listen, this is not the guy we're talking about when you're dealing with him right up front, right? He was certainly a crass, nasty, like I say, criminal, rather abusive individual to people that were beneath him for one reason or another, and certainly really interested in keeping his own power and his own goodies in check. So there's a lot of motivations that could be there. Johnson might even, by telling him he's making people unhappy, here's another thing to consider. That could be a strategic thing that he's letting him know for some other reason, because it's not like Johnson wouldn't lie about something in order to achieve a political end or steal an election or anything else. Again, look at his real history. There's a lot to it. You know what I mean? So it's hard, but there's certainly a lot of possibility there that Johnson would have not been alarmed or bothered by the idea that somebody was going to take Kennedy out. And that, to me, makes a lot more sense, but again, some people say I'm a little too harsh about what it is I want to see regarding evidence before I declare something. But again, show me what you got. And realistically, outside of the circumstantial that could tie, hundreds of military contractors and people whose futures were tied directly to it, oil men, yes, indeed, who were tied to Johnson too, but some of them might have had a motive. There were people in the steel industry that might have had a motive. There were people just for political reasons that might have had a motive. There were people that didn't appreciate even the most tacit of support for civil rights that might have had motives. There's 100 motives and a million suspects, and here's the problem. There's very, very little evidence to tie a lot of the people that probably weren't unhappy that John F. Kennedy was murdered to the actual case. And Johnson, again, in the late 60s, he certainly was a serious suspect. There were books written about it. There were accusations made about it because, logically speaking, again, it was his state. One of his mentors was there in the car, also wounded along with John F. Kennedy. Right? But did Johnson have that sort of juice in Dallas? Did Johnson have that kind of power? Did Johnson have the ability to have people murdered? And when you only have con men and con women who are out there pushing the story, it's difficult to sort it out, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, if you're going into the Johnson story, for sure. And, I like this wheat meeting, I just took that not as thinking, well, Johnson ordered this, or he's the mastermind of the assassination, but maybe he knew ahead of time. But even then, I don't know if he did, and I don't know how important it even is if he did.
Well, see, that's the thing, right? Is again, let's just assume that that's correct, that he knew ahead of time, that somebody tapped him on the shoulder and even said, "Hey, get ready to redecorate the White House because it's going to be yours." I'm
skeptical that he did know ahead of time, but whatever, doesn't matter.
But let's just take it for the sake of argument that he did.
Okay,
right? Even if he does know it, and even if he knows who did it, well, the fact is he never told us, so we don't know. And again, unless you can develop evidence outside of, well, what about Billy Celestes? Well, Billy Celestes is an admitted pathological liar, basically. What about Madeline Brown? Well, Madeline Brown also somebody who had some troubles with the truth, and even toward the end of her life, wound up with forgery charges on a few counts and everything else. it's really interesting to see who and what and why, and exactly what has been proven and what's simply been asserted out there. And unfortunately, in the modern age of dissemination of information, Mike, it's hard to sort it all out, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. But you do it every on Thursday nights. You shift into some of this evidence with your guests, and we're doing this on March the 5th. I'll be posting it up after that. But I'll be on your show tonight. I might talk about some of these LBJ tapes. I've been looking into some of them, so that people don't know about.
Oh, sure, because we never script it. So it's usually just whatever Mike comes with and whatever's on my mind, we mix it together, and all of a sudden an hour is gone. And
I'll put a link. I'm going to post this up on Sunday, and I'll put a link to tonight's show with this YouTube video, and I'm sure they can find the show you do with Robert Morrow once it's up. I'm going to be curious to hear that one myself.
Yeah, well, see, now you know there's going to be some tension in that conversation, but the agreement that we're not going to go into the LBJ thing, I'm actually here's the thing. Now, since you're going to post this on Sunday, I want to see if my prediction turns out right. I think he's going to fail to keep up his end of that. I think he's going to descend into it anyway during the conversation. But there you go.
Yeah, I bet money on that. He seems to be something. If he can't help but talk about that and someone's sexual scandal all the time. So.
Right. Exactly. That was exactly where I was going next. Is between that and some sexual discussion that I've already warned him. I really don't like to have cursing and stuff like that on my show. Please try not to do that. But I think at some point he's going to be stumbling around trying to figure out how to describe somebody's sexual scandal, and we'll get an LBJ killed JFK.
But he's
rant.
He's an interesting guy, so I'll be curious to hear it. He's an interesting fellow for sure.
Well, right, and I'm always respectful to anybody who's on the show. I mean, I do my best. I even had Roger Stone on the show, and I was very respectful to him. Which I don't have any respect to offer him, but I was respectful to him.
Well, you were even respectful to Jim Fetzer when he was going crazy.
I tried. Listen, I tried there. And, people have gotten angry at that whole show when Fetzer started screaming about Carmine and I have our heads up our backsides, I think. And
hey,
it was
do you have that on, do you know which exact show? Is it easily accessible?
Oh, yeah. If you, since this is going on
2015
YouTube.
November, right?
I believe it was 2015, the anniversary show, which I did a special broadcast on a Sunday night, and had John Hankey, Jim Fetzer, Brent Holland, and Carmine the whole way through. We did a 4-hour special. But the first hour was, I think, Jim Fetzer, and is
it on YouTube?
Yes, it is. It's on YouTube. I have a channel, by the way. So if you look for the Ochelli Effect, or if you look for Ochelli Fetzer, I'm sure you'll find it.
Okay.
But it's you can put a link if you like. I think it's still up there.
I'll look for it. It's classic.
But
thanks for.
I couldn't help it. It was just. But
Oh,
and by the way, Michael, I really appreciate the fact that you do Tuesdays with me, because it is one of the best nights, most informative. And even when you and I sit and talk about, we've talked about everything from the stock market to the assassinations, to current events, to Las Vegas, and how to play poker, right?
Yeah.
And it's always informative, and it's always really interesting, and a real pleasure to work with you or talk with you anytime that I can. Thank you.
Thanks, appreciate that. And we'll be talking in a couple hours, so everyone tune in. And thanks for taking the time to do this with me, too.
Absolutely. You're quite welcome.